chapter 13. Before I begin, is there any questions about what we just covered? Not so much? Okay, probably many, but you probably won't know them until you're done studying. All right, let's talk about the brain. All right, this is material that's going to be on your last lecture exam, okay? So when I talk about the brain, I want you to know the difference between the regions of the brain, all right, and then the lobes of the brain, okay? There's 4 regions of the brain, okay? The cerebrum, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the brainstem. Those are the 4 regions. So you need to know the difference between the regions and the lobes, because there are going to be 5 lobes in the cerebrum, okay? So don't be confused, especially when you're taking the lab test and an arrow is pointing to the cerebrum and it says name the lobe that it's pointing to. Don't say cerebrum. All right, you got to say frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, okay? So you need to be specific with that. So there's 4 regions. We're going to start off with the cerebrum today, okay? So that's the biggest part of the brain, okay? There's 2 hemispheres, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. All right, I should be more specific. A left cerebral hemisphere and a right cerebral hemisphere. And in each hemisphere, all right, there are 5 lobes. So when you're looking at the brain, if you look at this picture here, you can see on the brain it's got all these folds in it. All right, and then in between the folds, it's got these little depressions. And in some of these areas, you have deeper depressions. Okay? So the folds or the ridges are called gyri, if we're talking about it in the plural. If it's just one single one, it's a gyrus. Okay? And then in between, the shallow depressions are called a sulcus, if it's singular, or sulci, or sulci, if it's plural. And then the deeper ones are called fissures. Okay? You need to know all 3 of those, especially when we're getting to lab, because it'll help you to differentiate. Okay? Fissures are deep. Sulci are less deep. Gyri are the ridges or folds. Okay? And sometimes we'll use certain terms when we're referring to the brain, like rostral and caudal. Okay? So rostral is another name for anterior. All right? Caudal is another name for posterior. All right? A lot of that has to do with when we're describing the brain, especially from embryology and the development of the brain. Okay? But for the most part, I will use anterior and posterior. Okay? You don't have to worry about rostral and caudal. But I just want you to be familiar with those anatomical terms here. So again, this is a lateral view, all right, specifically the left side. All right? And so the cerebrum is pretty much all of this that you're seeing. Okay? All that folded material there. The cerebellum is this little guy on the bottom, and then you can see the brainstem here. And then on the inside, all right, is the diencephalon. That's like right in the middle there. Okay, we'll see that in a moment. Okay, so again, so you can just to kind of give you some heads up here. All right, anterior is the front part of the brain here. All right, posterior is back in this area here. Okay, so roughly your ear sits right around here. Okay, that's where your ear is going to be, and then your eyes will be down around here. Okay. All right, so this is an inferior view, and you can see all these structures. This view here is showing us, all right, these yellow structures coming off. This view is showing us your cranial nerves. Okay, and I briefly talked about when we were talking about the different divisions of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, structural versus functional. And when we talk about the structural components, if a nerve, basic, trust me, I'm not going to make it any more complicated than this, but if a nerve is coming off the brain, we call it a cranial nerve. If the nerve is coming off the spinal cord, we call it a spinal nerve. So all of these nerves that you're seeing here, these are all cranial nerves. All right? If they're a motor nerve, they're considered to be lower motor neurons. We'll get into all the different types here. All right, so now let's look at a mid-sagittal view. All right, we cut the brain in half, and now you can see the inside here a little bit better. All right, our diencephalon is right in here. Okay, that's that 4th region of the brain. Okay, so now you can see all 4 regions of the brain nicely. We'll talk about all these different parts. You have to know most of them, but not all of them. Okay, so let's start off with the first part, or the first region, excuse me, the cerebrum. Okay? So not only do you have to know some of the important anatomical structures there, all right, you do need to know that this is where what we refer to as complex intellectual functions, critical thinking, personality, reasoning, all right? So all of these things, plus many more, all right, are going to originate here. So we clump them into complex intellectual functions, higher order functioning, what makes us humans, all right, not a whale. Well, whales are actually pretty smart. I shouldn't compare it to a whale, all right? Okay, so I mentioned on the previous slide, or the first slide, that there's two hemispheres, a right cerebral hemisphere and a left cerebral hemisphere, okay? So we're going to see that more in the anterior superior portion of the cerebrum there, all right? And you can see all these different functions that are going on. All right, yes, intelligence, what you're doing right now, higher order thinking, all right, critical thinking, all right, reasoning, thought, memory, judgment, all right, voluntary motor, visual, all right, and auditory activities. All right, so a lot of your somatic sensory information is going to actually come into this area of the brain, okay? All right, so we're going to go through pretty much all of these here throughout this chapter, okay? All right. So a couple things that we do need to understand when we're dealing with the anatomy of the cerebrum. All right. In between the two hemispheres, you've got a structure. It's known as the longitudinal fissure, and that's this guy right here. I'll come right back to this slide. That's this structure right here. This is superior view. We're looking down at the top of the brain. This is the front. This is the back. All right. So you have this longitudinal fissure that goes right down the center of the brain. And it's going to divide the right cerebral hemisphere from the left cerebral hemisphere, okay? So inside, now brain matter, when we talk about brain matter, well, central nervous system, I should actually say, material, okay, is made up of two types of matter. All right, we'll talk a little bit more about it in lab, but you have gray matter and white matter. I'm sure you've heard the terms gray matter. You know, you don't have a lot of gray matter up there or whatever, all right? But white matter, okay, simple, is basically areas in the brain and spinal cord that is made up of myelinated axons. Because remember, myelin can only be on the axon. It doesn't go on the cell body, doesn't go on the dendrites, it's not on the synaptic knobs, okay? So wherever you see white matter, so as you read through this slide here, it says at a few locations, white matter, your brain is thinking, oh, okay, white matter, myelinated axons. Bang. That's what white matter is. Okay? Nothing else. Okay? In the brain, all right, excuse me, in the central nervous system, we refer to white matter as tracts. You need to know that. Because when we get into the peripheral nervous system, we refer to white matter as what? Do you remember? Nerves. Nerves. Same thing, just in different areas. So when we're in the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, white matter, all right, which is parallel bundles of myelinated axons, are known as tracts. Okay? Same thing in the peripheral nervous system, it's a nerve. Sciatic nerve. Okay? Axillary nerve, radial nerve. Okay? So, in this area here, all right, your hemispheres, your right and left cerebral hemispheres, they're not completely separate from one another. They can communicate with one another. So you literally have, all right, you've got these tracts, these myelinated axons that cross over. They go from one side over to the other side. Sometimes they're in small areas here and here, all right, but sometimes they'll cross over. So different parts of your brain can communicate with one another, all right? So that area where they cross over, okay, that is referred to, and this is something that you'll have to learn for lab 2, is the corpus callosum. Okay, they're called commissural tracks. Okay, they cross over from one side to the other. So it allows, all right, the cerebral hemispheres to communicate with one another, which is also good too, because if you damage, all right, one lobe or one side of your brain, the other side can help with that lost function. You might not regain all of it, okay, but it can help. So this will allow, all right, this occurrence, this, golly, I can't think today. This presence of the corpus callosum allows, all right, the brain to undergo multiple functions, all right, and communicate with different regions of the cerebrum here, okay? So most of the time, and we're going to talk about this throughout this chapter, okay, information that originates on the right side of your brain, okay, or on one side of your body is going to cross over and communicate to the other side. So basically, the right side of my brain controls the left side of my body and vice versa, okay? So we're going to see that. So most of these connections will usually cross, okay? So the example here is the left hemisphere receives sensory signals from the right side of the body and sends motor signals to the right side of the body. All right, that's what we're going to see. Now, there's always going to be some minor differences, okay, and we'll see that. We're going to talk about this term lateralization, okay, and basically that means certain functions are usually going to be controlled by one side of the brain. That's all that means. And these are higher order functions like speech. Right now, as I'm speaking to you, most likely, all right, because in a small percent of the population it's on the other side, but most likely the left side of my brain right now is allowing me to motor function speak to you. Okay? That's called, I'm using what's called my Wernicke's area. It's in my parietal lobe. All right? Now you're sitting there and you're listening to me, okay? And so you're actually, and if you're understanding at least the language that I'm using to you, maybe not some of the material that I'm trying to teach to you right yet, all right? But you're using what's called your Broca's area, and that's in the frontal lobe on the left side of your brain, okay? There's other functions that these areas use, but that's what we're talking about, all right? So this example, speech, left cerebral hemisphere, okay? Both the actual motor aspect of it and then the actual sensory aspect of understanding and comprehending what I'm saying, okay? That's going to be left side. All right, so let's break it down. First of all, let me just show you here, all right, from the superior view. You can see here's the frontal lobe, all right, and there's this structure right here. All right, it's tough to see, but you can see that we have different colors. This is kind of tan and this is kind of red. There's this black line, and that's representing the sulcus here. That's called the central sulcus. That's an important anatomical landmark in neuroanatomy, okay? Because that is the landmark, and I'll show you, especially when we're doing labeling in lab, how you can see that's the sulcus that divides, all right, the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Now, listen, y'all already have a pretty good idea about osseous anatomy, bones, okay? So when we learn the skull, all right, you know the frontal bones in the front, occipital bones in the back, parietal lobes are kind of on the top back, and then temporal are right by the ears. Well, guess what? You pretty much now know the locations of all the lobes of the brain because the lobes are named for the occipital bones to which they lay underneath. Okay, so the frontal lobe of the brain is in the front, behind your forehead. Okay, so that's what we're seeing here. Okay, so right behind the frontal lobe, you can see here's the parietal lobes in the superior posterior region of the brain, and then way back here, all right, is your occipital lobe. Has anyone ever fallen down on the back of their head and saw stars? Yeah, it's happened to me before, all right? And that's because the occipital lobe's in charge. It's on the back of your head. It's in charge of vision. It's your visual cortex, all right? And so when that lobe just kind of smashes into your skull briefly, all right, it sends out buku bunches of action potentials, and your eyes pick it up as seeing stars. You know, not literal stars, but you know what I mean, lights. All right, it stimulates those photoreceptors. Kind of a freaky thing. All right, so again, we have 5 lobes in each hemisphere, 4 of which you can see, all right, superficially. So if I pluck your brain out of your skull and I'm looking at it, I can see 4 of those lobes. Okay, and like I said, we name those for the overlaying cranial bones. All right, there's an invisible lobe. It's an inner lobe. All right, and we call that the insula. Okay, if you were to pry apart on the side, if you're looking at the brain from the side, and I'll show you a picture here in a bit, If you pry apart the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe from one another and you peek in, you'll see this other lobe in there, and that's the insular lobe. Okay? All right, so let's start off with the frontal lobe. Okay? The frontal lobe, right, is going to be obviously in the front. Right? Its posterior border, right? The anatomical structure that separates it from the parietal lobe is our central sulcus. Just anterior or in front of the central sulcus, I'll show you right here. All right, this gyrus right here that I'm kind of coloring in with the blue line here, that is known as our precentral gyrus. Okay, you can see how it is anterior or just in front, all right, of the central sulcus. This gyrus here is known as our primary motor cortex. Every single one of us right now, if you make any type of skeletal muscle movement, that signal originates here, that little area there. Okay, it comes from our precentral gyrus. Okay, so that's what's going to control voluntary movement. Voluntary movement. All right, so if we move down to the side or the lateral portion here, all right, of our cerebrum, we see this guy. All right, this is our lateral sulcus here, or fissure. Okay, now it's interesting to me because in some literature I've read it as a fissure, and some I've read it, like this book here, uses it as a sulcus. So either or is acceptable. All right, but this structure right here, the lateral fissure or lateral sulcus, separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. Then you can see here how the central sulcus here divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe here. Okay. All right. So again, our frontal lobe is going to carry on a lot of our higher order intellectual functioning. Intelligence, personality, all right, speech, okay, decision making, hopefully good decision making, all right, concentration, all these, all right, functions are considered to be higher order functions. All right, so that's for the frontal lobe. All right, the parietal lobe, which is right behind the frontal lobe, all right, on the superior portion, so it's going to be superior posterior to the cerebrum. All right, so its anatomical, its anterior border is going to be that central sulcus. So just behind it here, all right, what I'm shading in here, all right, this is the post-central gyrus. Okay, it's just posterior, just behind that precentral, the central sulcus there. Okay, and this area, all right, this post-central gyrus is responsible, all right, it's what we call our somatosensory cortex. So for sensory information. Okay, ultimately, sensory information will arrive, hopefully, to that area. All right, so you can figure out, all right, maybe the shape of something. Okay, if it's hard. All right, if it's soft, if it's furry, all right, if it's sticky, okay, that information will arrive here to the post-central gyrus, okay? If we go further back, all right, all the way back to the back of the brain, okay, you're going to see another sulcus there. It's called the parietal occipital sulcus, and that divides or separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. And then again, we have the lateral sulcus, all right, that will divide the temporal and occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. Okay, but this area, think of the parietal lobe as having to do a lot of sensory functioning. Okay, a lot of sensory information gets relayed to this area. We'll talk about some of that. We'll talk about a lot of it, actually. All right, and then on the side of your head, all right, you have the temporal lobe. Okay, so this is going to be just below the lateral sulcus. And its job, real basic, hearing and smell. Hearing is easy to remember because the ear sits right on top of it, right? Because the temporal bone sits right on top of the temporal lobe. Okay, so hearing, that's easy. You just got to kind of memorize smell for that one. Okay. Further on back, okay, occipital lobe, that's going to be vision and visual memories. What's a visual memory? Say a year from now, this class is done. All right, it's a far distant memory for you. You're at Publix, I'm at Publix, you see me in Publix, you recognize my face. Oh, that's Dr. Kaz. That's a visual memory, okay? So that's stored in your occipital lobe. Just some of these lobes are easy to remember, like occipital is easy, it's just pretty much vision, okay? And then lastly, the invisible lobe, okay, the one that you cannot see superficially is the insula, okay? And the insula has to do with memory and taste, okay? So again, it's hidden below, or not below, but behind the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. Just kind of peel them away. All right, questions? Not too bad, not too bad. All right. So now what I'd like to do is we just talked about the lobes. Now we're going to talk about what we call the functional areas of the cerebrum. What parts of the cerebrum, all right, are going to have specific functions? For example, we just talked about the occipital lobes. When we talk about vision, we're going to talk about where that's located in the occipital lobe. And we're going to talk about some of the more specifics now. I want to talk first about the motor areas. Okay, motor areas, all right, have a couple different regions, right, depending on, or excuse me, a couple different lobes, depending on what type of motor function we're talking about, okay? So primarily, the motor areas are going to be within the frontal lobes here. I remember that precentral gyrus, that's our primary motor cortex, all right? So when you are going to initiate some sort of skeletal movement, right, it starts there, okay? So you need to know this, that the primary motor cortex is going to control skeletal muscle activity, but where? Opposite side. On the opposite side. So that means that some neurons have to cross from the left to the right or from the right to the left. Okay, but it's opposite side. Now, here's the thing. It can cross over, all right, in the brain stem, or which is in the brain, obviously, or it can cross over in the spinal cord. Okay, but it has to cross. Okay, so the way that we view our bodies, okay, is much different. Like my visual system, my eyes, when I look at me, and you look at you, and I look at you, and you look at me, we view our bodies much differently than what our brain views our bodies. It's really kind of freaky. I'm going to show you this picture here. It's called the Motor Homunculus, right? And basically, there's certain regions, all right, of our primary motor cortex, or that precentral gyrus, all right, that a certain amount of nervous tissue real estate is going to be dedicated to specific areas of your body, which means, all right, areas that you need to have more like motor control over, fine motor movements like your hands, all right, are going to have a lot of nervous tissue real estate. They're going to take up a lot of space in the motor homunculus, all right, or excuse me, in the precentral gyrus. All right, so let me show you. So it's definitely going to be a distorted depiction of your body, all right, and again, it depends on how much, all right, of that real estate that your motor cortex has dedicated to that body part. So for example, look at that, okay? Now you obviously know, all right, that your hand, all right, is not as big as your thorax and your abdomen, okay? But the amount of motor function and sensitivity, I shouldn't say sensitivity because I don't want you to think of sensation, but precision, all right, motor units and whatnot, are going to be highly dedicated to certain areas where you see fine motor movement, okay? Obviously your hand, all right, parts of your face, think of all the muscles of facial expression, all right? Your tongue has quite a bit, all right? So again, your motor homunculus, and this is basically shown here, you can see, here's the primary motor cortex, that precentral gyrus there. All we've done is we've just dissected it anterior to posterior. This is the lateral portion, so your ear would be over here, okay? And this is going to be the central portion of your brain. And you can see all of this real estate, all right, for certain areas. Lips and jaw, all right, quite a bit. Eyelids and eyeball, that's quite a bit of real estate that has been dedicated to it. When you break it down, not much in the arm, okay? So this is how your primary motor cortex views your body, okay? So just consider it. The more the precise movement, is, the more nervous tissue surface area is dedicated to it. Okay, that's why that motor homunculus looks funky. Okay. All right, so that's just basic skeletal motor movement. So when you're initiating a skeletal movement, all right, you're like, I want to move my arm. All right, it starts there. Okay, now we can refine those movements, and we'll talk about how we refine those movements later on. All right, another motor area, speech, me. All right, what I am doing to you right now is I am moving my jaw and controlling my breathing, all right, is going to be controlled by the motor speech area, also known as Broca's area. Okay, this is in the front lobe. All right, now here's the thing. It's mainly in the left lobe. There's always exceptions to the rule. Okay, but for most people, all right, well over 90% of us, all right, our Broca's area is going to be in the left frontal cortex there. Okay, so this is going to control, all right, vocalization. So all those muscles around my larynx, my voice box, all right, even the skeletal muscles, the voluntary skeletal muscles that I use, all right, in my throat, all right, my diaphragm, I'm actually controlling my breathing, all right, some of the muscles that I use to control quiet breathing and forced breathing, all right, are all going to be utilized in this Broca's area here. Okay, Broca's area does play a role there. Okay, Frontal Eye Field. All right, this here is when we want to regulate some of our eye movements. Like when I need to go, like right now, if I'm reading my screen and I look up at that clock on the back wall, when I look up there, my eyes have to focus. All right, they have to go from that nearsightedness to that farsightedness and see far away. All right, we call that accommodation. There's a whole bunch of reaction. We'll talk some about that more so in chapter 16. All right, but this occurs, all right, in the motor area there. Okay. Now, we're going to learn and we're going to talk about how when we do certain functions, all right, certain specialized functions, right, it's not just one area of the brain that does all the work, all right? It gets input from other areas, and especially if it's a refined function like playing the piano or doing some juggling or actually doing something that requires a lot of dexterity. Okay, so we have another area which is just in front, all right, of our primary motor cortex. It's just in front, all right, of our precentral gyrus, and that's called the pre-motor cortex. We refer to that as an association area because this area is associated, all right, with motor movement. So it's also known as the somatic motor association area. Okay, so it's going to be just in front of the premotor cortex. All right, and this now is where we're going to take some of those skilled or those practiced activities, like learning how to play the piano or the flute or something that requires a lot of painting, whatever, okay? Dribbling a basketball, any type of sporting activity that requires a lot of dexterity, all right? A lot of this information is kept here in the premotor cortex, okay? An easy way to remember where motor function areas are related to sensory function areas is the motor of your car is usually in the front. Okay, so the motor areas of your brain are usually in the front, in the frontal lobe. Sensory areas are going to be in the back, unless you're driving a VW Bug, in which they had the old ones. They had the motor in the back. That's all. Right. But anyways, I think the VW buses did too. Okay. Sensory areas, okay? So, we learn motor. Now, sensory areas we're going to see are going to be pretty much in a lot of other areas throughout, all right, the cerebrum. All right, but we're going to start off and talk about the parietal lobes. Okay, so let's start off with the primary somatosensory cortex. All right, that is found anatomically in the post-central gyrus, right behind the central sulcus there. All right, so its job, all right, is going to receive that somatic sensory information. Okay, so what is somatic sensory information? Pretty much information that you can consciously perceive. How hot it is, okay? If something is sharp, if something is painful, all right? If vibration, okay? Anything that you can consciously perceive is going to come into this area here, okay? We'll talk more about what proprioception is, but that's relations to body movement, okay? These specialized type of receptors, these proprioceptors, are found all throughout your muscles and joints. And it helps to provide feedback to your brain as to where your body is in relationship to itself. So we've got another homunculus here, okay? And again, it's going to be somewhat distorted when we're talking about the proportions of our body. Somewhat similar to the motor, okay? But again, think about it. The areas of your body that are more sensitive, all right, are going to have more real estate, all right, invested in those areas. So lips, fingers, genital areas, if you look at this thing, okay, here you can really see how much real estate, all right, that the sensory homunculus takes up, okay, in that postcentral gyrus for the face. Tons. Hand and the face and the tongue. Look at that, all right? That's close to half. I'm willing to say that it's about half. All right, that's quite a bit. Okay, so just keep in mind, the more sensitive the area, okay, all right, the more sensory information that we're going to get from there. Okay, all right, so we just saw in the motor, all right, cortex there, that we have a motor association area, okay, well, we're also going to have a sensory association area. And it's going to be in close approximation to the primary somatosensory cortex. All right, it too is going to be in the parietal lobe, but in this case, it's going to be behind, all right, the postcentral gyrus, or behind the primary somatosensory cortex there. All right, so again, this is going to also help us to identify, all right, sensory information. Okay, for example, okay, I close my eyes, and you're going to put objects in my hand. All right, and you put in something that's a key, a car key. Okay, this is the first time I've ever held a car key in my life. I wouldn't be able to identify that because I have no idea what it is. I'll be able to tell you it's metal, it's cold. All right, there's some rough edges to it, but I wouldn't know what it was until you're like, hey, that's a car key. Okay, now I know it's a car key. All right, so then when you put it again into my hand, all right, as long as that information made it to the somatosensory association area, then I would be able to identify whatever that object is. I mean, oh, that's a car key, all right? Or if it was a pen, and I had held the pen in my hand before, okay? So that's where you're going to start to create some memory information that's going to allow you to store some of this sensory input, all right, from your external environment there. All right, a couple other sensory areas here, all right? Think vision, occipital lobe. All right, and our visual cortex also has a visual association area. Also in, all right, the occipital lobe. All right, and that's where we're going to have our memory. Again, you've seen me at Publix. All right, also color. Okay. Auditory, temporal lobe. Again, auditory association area, temporal lobe. So it's like when you hear a song for the first time, you're like, I like this song. Okay, that's cool. Taylor Swift. All right, awesome. All right. Then a day later, you're driving down the road, and that same song comes on. You're like, I recognize that song. That's Taylor Swift. All right. Now you've retrieved that information from your auditory association area, and it helps recall that sound memory. Okay. So again, keep in mind, a lot of these association areas are going to be immediate. I'm not going to say this for everything, but most of the association areas are going to be located adjacent, all right, to the primary cortex region for whatever that function is. Okay, so like visual, all right, is going to be in the occipital lobe. The association visual cortex or association area will be in the occipital lobe. All right. All right, olfaction, smell. Again, we saw that smell was in the temporal lobe. All right. We'll see, now olfactory gets a little bit different because now we're going to play with the limbic system, and there's some other things, and we'll talk about that later on in this chapter. All right, but again, this is where we're going to have that conscious awareness of smell. Something, if it's pleasant to you, if it's offensive to you, all right, all that will come from the primary olfactory cortex there. Gustatory, this will be taste, that's in the insula, okay, the hidden lobe. Questions? No? All right. Hold the KB. Okay, so continuing on with some of the functional areas, all right, of the cerebrum here. Right, now what we're going to do is, now we're going to start talking about areas that work in concert with other areas in the brain, okay? So we're going to integrate this information from many of the association areas throughout, all right? I don't know if I have it in this slideshow. No, I don't. Okay, I had a really cool picture in my previous slideshow, but I don't have it here. All right, that actually kind of explains the integration of the multiple association areas. All right, so when we're talking about the prefrontal cortex, all right, our premotor cortex, all right, we're going to, prefrontal cortex, which is in front, all right, anterior or rostral to the premotor cortex. This is where we're going to see, all right, a lot of that higher order functioning like I was talking about before, okay? Decision making, okay? Personality, conscious thoughts, all right? Critical thinking, all of that is going to be located in the prefrontal cortex, all right? Now this area is going to develop through adolescence. Does anyone know what adolescence, the age range is? Has anyone taken a sociology class or psychology class? Adolescence. Think of it as the teenage years, and in some cases, the early 20s. All right, and I'm not saying like 24. All right, I'm talking about like possibly 21, 22. Okay, that's what adolescence is going to be. So pretty much the primary like puberty area. All right, like teenage years. All right, late teens, early 20s in some cases. Okay, so this is still undergoing development, and I can attest that the way I think now granted I'm in my 40s. All right, but I think differently in my 40s than I did in my 20s than I did in my teens, and most people do, okay? That's why some people are better suited to go to college maybe later on in their life, because they can undergo that critical thinking after this area has developed a little bit better, okay? So Wernicke's area, you heard me talk about Broca's area. Now Broca's area, all right, was that motor speech area, okay? So that's what I'm using right now. That was in the frontal lobe here, okay? Wernicke's area, again, it's in the left hemisphere, okay? But Wernicke's is more, most likely in the parietal lobe. And I say most likely because sometimes these areas can change, all right? But most commonly, all right, it's going to be, all right, one in the left hemisphere and in the parietal lobe. This is language comprehension. You're using your Wernicke's right now. If you were to lesion your Wernicke's area, okay, if you were to lesion it, right, you would be able to talk, okay, you'd be able to talk to me about whatever, right? But when I talk to you and you had the lesion of Wernicke's, you wouldn't understand what the heck I'm saying. I could be talking like I am now, but you would hear gobbly, it would just be garbled. You wouldn't understand a darn thing, okay? So if Wernicke's area gets lesioned, damaged, brain bleed or whatever, right, you would have a hard time with language comprehension. All right, which brings me into autism. All right, this is, when I say autism is a relatively new topic. When I was growing up, you know, we didn't really talk about autism too much. All right, there's a lot of research that's gone into this field in the past 30 years. Okay, so we're seeing this is a stunning number here. 1 in 88 U.S. children are affected with autism. Now, autism is a spectrum. You guys know what that means, right? All right, it varies. You can have a high and a low, and everything in between. It's a spectrum, okay? So, and that spectrum ranges in severity of the symptoms, all right? In some cases, it could just be somebody that you would look at and just be like, oh, that person's just kind of socially awkward. They're mild. Right? And there's some that they can't even have human contact. There's a good friend's wedding a couple years ago, and I think the boy was like a nephew of somebody. And of course, at the reception, we're all dancing and everybody's having a good time. And this boy just was doing laps around the dance floor. And that was the best way, you know, and he wasn't severely autistic, and he would come on the dance floor at times. But when you have autism, depending on how severely you're affected, think of it as a lot of sensory input just coming in at you. Sounds, sights, touch. I mean, it's almost like you're just super sensitive to everything in some cases, all right? Yeah, it's just you're overstimulated, just every possible input that you could possibly receive. And again, it varies depending on. So the best way that this young man could handle it, this little boy I should say, was just to do laps. And that's how he coped with it. All right, now there's, again, tons of different, for the most part, autism is unknown, the cause of it. No one knows, all right? Still, there's theories. You know, I went to a seminar and they talked about one of the causes for autism or how you can help to treat autism is through diet. A lot of processed foods and vitamin D deficiency were some of the theories as to what causes autism. So they were kind of messing around with that. It was actually some really interesting, and so there's still more coming out. Now we have, you know, these theories, genetic, environmental, biochemical. All right, there's still, again, this is relatively new. We're looking into it, but this is my favorite. Vaccines found not to be a factor. Do y'all remember? Well, some of you are probably too young, but you guys have probably heard. You know, there's a big, you know, they call it the anti-vaxxer movement. Again, I'm not here to say that that's wrong, or I'm not saying it's right. All I'm saying is, you know, they say that vaccines are found not to be a factor, and the reason why vaccines were considered to be a factor in the first place is because there was a doctor that went through all these different studies, right? And I can't remember the type of study that he formulated from this, but basically he just collected all this data from all these studies and then made this hypothesis from all those different studies and said that vaccines, you know, were a factor. And that's kind of where that whole thing moved from, all right? Here's the thing. The only way, or the best way, in my opinion, is to determine if a vaccine is a factor in causing autism. You would have to create a study in which you are trying to cause autism in kids through vaccinations. Who in their right mind, what parent would be like, that's a good idea. Here's my kid. You know, here, let's put, you know, make sure I'm getting paid a lot. No one would ever do that. So you can't have a study for that, you know? All right, we will see, all right, that autism will affect, all right, men more than women, okay? Males versus females. Okay. What? Central white matter? What is white matter? Here it is. Here it is. You thought I was making it up. I wasn't. Myelinated axons. Bundles of myelinated axons are going to be our white matter. Now, when we're dealing with the brain, since we'll talk about the spinal cord later on, not today, all right, but when we're dealing with the brain, from an anatomical standpoint, there's two types of matter, gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is on the outside, okay? It's like the eggshell, okay? The white matter will be deep to the gray matter, okay? So that's what we're saying. The cerebral cortex, all right, is that outer, here we go. There's the cerebral cortex. You can see it here. There's the cerebral cortex. This is outer gray matter, and then deep to it, we've got white matter. Now, you're going to have globs or islands of gray matter within the white matter. Okay, we'll talk about that. All right, we'll get to that. All right, but just keep in mind, the outside of the brain is gray matter. Okay, so what's gray matter? All right, I told you what white matter is because that's the easier one to tell you. Gray matter is pretty much everything else. Well, what's everything else? Okay, glial cells, cell bodies, all right, unmyelinated axons, all right, cell bodies and dendrites, and I'm missing something. It'll come to me. Dang it. All right, anyways. So the white matter is going to lie deep to the cerebral cortex, okay? So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about these tracks, okay, which are basically myelinated axons running throughout the brain, okay? So there's a couple different kinds, all right? There's three types that we're going to talk about: association tracks, commissural tracks, and projection tracks, okay? Well, the association tracks, these guys are pretty cool because they're going to all stay within the same hemisphere. So what they're going to do is they're just going to connect, all right, different regions of the cerebral cortex to one another, okay, of the same hemisphere, okay? So there's two subtypes. We have the arcuate, which are the shorter ones, so they're just going to connect one gyri to its neighbor. All right, that's easy. The longitudinal fasciculi, these are going to be the longer ones, okay? These will connect a gyri from the frontal lobe to, say, the gyri in the parietal lobe, okay? So it's going to go to a different lobe, okay? So those are your association tracks. They stay on the same side, asymmetrical, same side. All right, so commissural tracks. These guys like to get out and mingle a little bit, All right, they're the more adventuresome track because now they're going to go to different hemispheres, which means they got to cross over. Okay, they got to cross from one side to the other side, left to right or right to left. That's it. Okay, the real basic. All right, so there's three types. The Corpus Callosum, which is the biggest one. Okay, then you have these two smaller ones, the anterior and posterior commissural fibers. Okay, but the Corpus Callosum is the one that you really need to know. And I'll show you a picture here. You know me, I like pictures. Okay, so let's start off here with the association tracks. They stay all on the same side. Okay, so here, all right, we have our smaller arcuate fibers, and they just go from one gyri to the neighboring one. And then you've got these longitudinal fasciculi. These are the ones that will go from, in this case, this guy can go here from the frontal lobe all the way back to the occipital lobe. Or you can go from the frontal to the parietal, parietal to the frontal. Okay, cool. And then our commissural tracks are going to cross over from left to right or right to left. Here's the corpus callosum. This is the biggest commissural fibers here in the brain. All right, and then you got the anterior commissure here, and the posterior commissure is going to be back here. It's not depicted. All right, so the third type, all right, of track is going to be the projection track. So you got one that goes side to side, front and back, but what about up and down? Well, here you go. Here are the projection tracks. These guys are going to go from the cerebral cortex, right? Cerebral cortex is that gray matter, right, to the lower parts of the brain and to the spinal cord. Okay? So to the inferior brain regions, and then it'll also go down to the spinal cord. So we give them special names like cortical spinal tract. It tells you it originates in the cortex, cerebral cortex. Where does it go? To the spinal cord. Okay? Cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. All right. Now, we'll talk about these other structures later on, the thalamus, okay, cerebral nuculi. All right. I'm going to hold off on talking about the cerebral nuculi because I know I will cover it in lab, okay? But we're going to see that these projection tracks on their way from the cerebral cortex down to the more inferior portions are going to run through a couple of the structures. Some of those, the thalamus, which is a huge, huge neurological structure that we'll get into much detail about it. Think of it as like the relay station, right? For information to come to your conscious perception or awareness, it has to make it to the thalamus and beyond. Once it gets to the thalamus and beyond, then you will have conscious awareness of it for sensory information. If it never makes it to the thalamus, you'll never know. You could step on a nail, but if that information never made it to the thalamus, you wouldn't have known it. You would not have known it, okay? Unless you see the blood, okay? And then the cerebral nuculi are just other gray matters, okay? So we refer to this as the internal capsule. I'll show you a picture here. All right, here you can see, all right, the projection fibers. Here's the commissural fibers going from left to right. They're crossing over from one hemisphere to the next. The projection fibers are going from the cerebral cortex all the way down here into the spinal cord. Okay? And here's the thalamus, all right? And then you can see we've got the internal capsule. We'll have fibers that come in from those structures too. More on that later. All right, you can even see here in the projection tract, you see that they cross over. Because remember I told you, fibers will cross over. And I said they'll either cross over, right, here in the brain or down in the spinal cord. Okay. All right. Patellas, basically, the only thing I want you to know about these are just anatomical asymmetries. All right. For example, you can see that on the right side here, all right, the frontal lobe protrudes past the frontal lobe on the left side, and vice versa. All right. And again, all right, you'll see that this has to do with, all right, the handedness here. A right-handed person can have their frontal, all right, patella sticking out further, and that most likely they'll be a right-handed person. Okay, left-handed, opposite. It's worth mentioning. All right, cerebral lateralization. Okay, you heard me mention cerebral lateralization earlier. Okay, and basically, all right, what that is certain sides of the brain have to do with certain higher order functions. Okay? So we're going to get into that now. Okay? Certain sides, like for example, speech, mainly on the left side. Okay? Both motor function of speech and sensory comprehension function of speech is going to be on the left side in most people. All right? So now when we're going to talk about cerebral lateralization, we're going to talk about these two characteristics, categorical and representational. Okay? Now, in most cases, and I'll describe what categorical is, all right, in a moment here. But in most cases, all right, the categorical hemisphere is the left hemisphere. The representational will be the right. Okay? So the categorical hemisphere, I always think of like the intellectual. Doesn't mean that you're an intellectual, but just more like the intellectual thought, like mathematics, like word problems, analytical thinking, all right? When we talk about language abilities, how well you're able to understand and comprehend language skills, okay? So we're going to see that under the categorical hemisphere. Again, on the left side, all right, that it will include Wernicke's and Broca's, or the motor speech area there, all right? Representational, I think of more of kind of, I don't want to say hippie, all right, but more of the artist and musician type, okay? So this is usually the right side. So these folks are great with visual spatial relationships. I shouldn't say these folks. This hemisphere has to do with more of the art. Has anyone here ever taken an art appreciation class? I had to take one a long time ago, golly, 20 years ago, right? And I didn't really know much about art. I'm like, I know if I like it, I don't like it. It's like wine, you know if it's a good wine, if you like it, if it's a bad wine, you don't like it, okay? But with art appreciation, they got into all these different aspects of art, which gave me literally an appreciation for it, all right? But folks that have a much better visual spatial understanding and gifted in that can, are better drawers, for example. They can see things in much different ways. If you've ever read the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, the author talks about how there's two types of people in this world, a classic and a romantic. And he always uses motorcycles in most of his analogies. And a classic would look at a motorcycle and see metal pipes, leather seats, mirrors, chrome, whatever. Romantic would look at a motorcycle and just see the nice curves and how one part of the bike transitions and the nice flowing movement of the wheels. So it's just kind of similar to this, but that's how I always remember. So folks, I shouldn't say folks, excuse me. The right hemisphere, the representational hemisphere, is going to be way more geared towards visual spatial relationships, imagination, big time, okay? And then it helps with how some of the senses can compare and contrast with one another, okay? All right, so the nice thing, again, these hemispheres communicate to each other through the commissural fibers, all right? Mainly through the corpus callosum and the anterior and posterior commissural fibers, all right? So that's how we're able to get that information to both sides. But for most of us in this room, all right, our left hemisphere is where we're going to be doing a lot of our analytical thinking, all right? A lot of our language skills will be based there, okay? And then for most of us, the right side will be the side that's going to be quite active when we're looking at art, we're trying to draw, or listening to music, all right? Or if the right hemisphere in little kids when they're playing imaginary games is lit up like crazy, okay? So speaking of kids, this process occurs at a young age. So around 5 and 6, we're going to start to see which hemisphere is going to be the representational hemisphere and which hemisphere is going to be the categorical hemisphere, okay? So we start to see that between those ages there, okay? And with women, this is great for you ladies. All right, your corpus callosum, the posterior portion of it, is thicker, which allows for more commissural fibers. So in some situations, all right, if you were to suffer a stroke, all right, more on the anterior portion, all right, of your cerebrum, you would be less affected than someone like myself because you have more commissural fibers in the posterior region of the corpus callosum there. So for me, all right, I would have, all right, or possibly, I shouldn't say I would, but I would have the probability of me having a higher functional loss is more likely, all right? And we have correlated that lateralization is based with, or is correlated with if you're right-handed or left-handed, okay? So most right-handed people, so if you're right-handed, it's highly likely that your left hemisphere is going to be the categorical. All right. Now we say almost always. There's always exceptions, but for the most part, all right. Well over 95% of us that are. I'm a right-handed person, so I'm assuming that my left cerebral hemisphere is my categorical hemisphere, and then my right cerebral hemisphere is going to be my representational. Now, if you're left-handed, it's a 50-50 split. Okay. Your right cerebral hemisphere could be the categorical. All right. But if you're right-handed, most likely your left cerebral hemisphere is going to be the categorical. Okay, kind of neat. So this picture here kind of depicts, all right, all these areas here, all right, that we're going to see, all right, for one, cerebral lateralization and some of the functionality or functional representation. So here you can see the left hemisphere, all right, you've got your Broca or motor speech area here in the frontal lobe. We go back here, we can see Wernicke's area in the parietal lobe, all right, for language comprehension and whatnot. All right. And then you can see on the left hemisphere, this is going to be your categorical hemisphere, analytical thinking, all right, reading comprehension and whatnot. Over here would be your like artistic visual spatial relationship, all right. All right, 2 more slides, then we'll take a break. I just want to talk about epilepsy. Okay, I've got a father-in-law that's epileptic, okay, and so I've always wondered, well, I knew, but I mean, I've never known anybody with epilepsy. And again, epilepsy, it varies, all right, yes, it's a neurological disorder, which basically what I tell folks, it's a short-circuiting of the brain. You get these random action potentials. Now, it depends, you know, on what type of epilepsy you have, okay. Some epilepsy can be resultant from some sort of TBI, traumatic brain injury. Okay, some can be genetic. You could just have it, born with it. Okay, so there's varying regions. Now, my father-in-law, he got his from a trauma that I think he hit his head when he was a kid or got into a bike accident. All right, but this is what happens. Essentially, you get rapidly firing action potentials, all right, at a high frequency. Okay, so just shooting off all this, and it depends on where these action potentials occur. If it's near the motor cortex, then you can have seizures. All right, and in some cases, you can have it if it's more in the frontal lobe, all right, and it depends on which region there. You could be talking to somebody, and you'll notice that they'll just start to look off, all right? And that type of epilepsy, all right, you've ever heard of a petit mal seizure? It's a very mild type of seizure. And I'm not saying that's epilepsy, but again, epilepsy is on a spectrum too, all right? But on a real mild case of epilepsy, they could have where they're just, you know, those action potentials are firing, and they're not able to concentrate, and you'll just see them just kind of go off. It happens all the time. All right, so what do? Drugs. That's how we treat them. Valproic acid is the #1 drug for epilepsy. Okay, we love to give it to folks. All right, but in some cases, all right, we might have to do surgery, take out a part of the brain. Okay, and in some cases, we have to actually undergo a complete hemisphere removal. Is I don't know of anybody that's had that. All right, I think that was a much more, and again, I'm not in psychiatry, so I couldn't tell you. All right, does it happen still? Probably in severe cases. If the symptoms are bad enough, you might have to. But here again, if we remove a certain region of the brain, I shouldn't say region, a certain part or a part of a lobe, remember, we still have the other lobe on the other side of the brain to help make up that functional deficit, because our brains can do that. You've seen it with people with strokes all the time. Right? They might not get 100% back to how they once were because of the scar tissue and the ischemia and the damaged tissue in the brain, but we can get them close to it, and you can get some neurological restoration of function in other regions close by. Okay, so that's what we'll see. We'll see, all right, how that can happen. Which leads me to finally, since I was talking about stroke here, CVA, cerebral vascular accident. Okay, so we're dealing with a stroke. All right, couple of causes for a stroke: brain aneurysm, in which you actually get a blood vessel bursting, right, and bleeding out, and the blood starts to bleed into the brain spaces, which we'll talk about, and press on some of the nervous tissue of the brain and cause problems. You can have reduced blood flow, ischemia, right, in which you get tissue death, So that's what we can get. We'll see either a blocked blood vessel or a blood vessel that breaks. All right. Now, if it's mild, obviously the symptoms will be less. All right. If it's more severe and if it's prolonged, then obviously the resultant signs and symptoms are going to be worse. And it depends on how much tissue death has occurred. All right. If it's for several minutes, for a very prolonged period of time, that's going to be a problem. Okay. So the symptoms vary. All right, blurred vision. Some people just talk about weakness, and it can be mild weakness. Some headaches, see that quite frequently. You know, especially in a severe cerebral vascular accident, CVA. If they say this is the worst headache in my life, you're going to the ER. Bye. You're going. Get out of my office. We're calling the ambulance. Not get out of my office. Let me call the ambulance. They're going to take you there. All right. So it depends on the symptoms. It really depends on where a lot of these, where the brain. The stroke occurred, all right? If it's in the front, side, back, inside, internal, okay? So it's going to affect, remember, the opposite side of the body. If the stroke is on the right side of the brain, you're going to see the symptoms on the left side of the body, okay? Now, I had a good friend of mine who had a TIA, transient ischemic attack, also known as a mini stroke, and apparently I just found out that my neighbor just had one, and he was in the hospital. I mean, I see him. He says he still thinks that his lip droops a little bit. I don't see it. But anyways, he was in his 30s when he had his TIA. But he did not take very good care of himself. He's much better now. Quit smoking, you know, doesn't eat garbage all the time, and doesn't crack his own neck. So that's it for stroke. That's it for the brain today. Let's take a break, and we'll get back and talk about some of the brain material here in